Hello again, how are you? Right now, we're going to look at the English language, a short history. Now, the reason why I want to go over the English language is that I feel that as English teachers, we should know a little bit about the English language, what we're teaching basically. So, this is why this is kind of still in the instruction part of the course. A little bit of background knowledge. To help you understand the English language, and with better understanding comes better teaching, as far as I'm concerned. So, let's have a look. English is spoken by 1/5 of the world's population, so that's massive. That's like 1.5 billion people. And it's rising, and more and more people are getting connected to the internet and are finding opportunities to learn English. It is growing, and wow, if you speak English, then you can speak to 1/5 of the world's population. It's quite interesting, though, that it's not exactly native speakers who speak English. Only actually a small percentage of that 1/5 are native speakers. So what I mean by that is that it's their first language. A lot of those speakers it's their second language. It's used for trade or business or other purposes. In fact, around about 80% of English is spoken between two non-native English speakers. So it's mostly happening between people who aren't from the USA, Canada, England. It's more like a German guy is speaking to a Turkish guy or a woman. One doesn't speak German, the other one doesn't speak Arabic, although Germany and actually Turkey have quite a strong relation. Let's choose another example. A German with a Japanese guy, right? They are using English to communicate with each other. It's just a tool, essentially. And corporations are adapting this. I think I can't remember if it was Mercedes, but their corporate language is English. So everything that's done within their organization must be done in English because it's just the most convenient way of communicating. So what happened in the past? Well, you should probably know this, but English comes from England, the British Isles. And it has a very interesting history. Obviously, Britain is an island, but apparently, according to scientists, in the last ice age, the short space between Calais and Dover, which is that really short space between France and England, was actually iced over, or there was less, because there was more ice, there was less water, so people could just wander from mainland Europe to Britain. In fact, essentially it was part of the continent. So that's perhaps how the original Celts arrived to Britain. They say the Celts who stayed in England were different from the ones in Ireland, because the ones in Ireland could actually swim, so that's how they got there. I don't know, that's an old wives' tale, but so the Celts were all happily living in Britain, and then along came the Romans and Julio Caesar, managed to conquer Britannia, as he named it, and I think the Celts were actually quite happy with the Romans. You've seen that old Monty Python sketch. What did the Romans ever do for us? Well, they brought aqueducts, they brought education, they brought wine, they brought roads. They actually did a lot for the Celts, so they were quite happy with the Romans living there, as far as I'm concerned. What happened next, though, was the fall of the Roman Empire, and that meant everyone was like, right, let's go back to sunny old Italy, seeing as everything's gone chaotic over here. And I think the Celts were like, oh, okay, fair enough. They were all whatever. There was a lot of history, so we know a lot about it. And then came the Dark Ages. and the Dark Ages really came in this early 400s here, 400 to 500, when these Angles and these Saxons from what would be modern day North Germany took some boats. Guess they weren't happy where they were living. They thought, well, we'll try something else. Took some boats and went over to Britain. And I don't think the Britons were too happy about that, the Celts, because the Angles and the Saxons were not particularly very educated. They were basically barbarians and very violent people, I assume. And they just took East England for themselves. That's why we have what is the period was called, the Anglo-Saxons, which comes from English, Angles, English. So the thing about them was that they weren't particularly well educated. They weren't like the Romans, and that's why we don't have a whole lot of history about what happened during those 500 years. It was only until the first piece of written text was discovered, which is called Beowulf. That's when we discovered that's the first written example of Old English, which is barely recognisable today. They say a language is you can go back 500 years and it's still recognisable. You go back 1,000 years and it's completely different. But that was the first written piece of English ever discovered, Beowulf. You can check it out on Wikipedia. And then came along 1066, famous part of history. There were some, the Normans as well. Sorry, not the Normans. You had the Vikings up north from modern day Norway, tried to invade England in the northeast coast of England, and King Harold successfully defended them off. And literally, like the same week, the Normans decided to invade from the south. So he had to fight two armies in the space of about a week, walking up to the north of England and then back down to the south of England. And but poor old King Harold got an arrow in his eye at the Battle of Hastings. And so the Normans essentially, I guess you'd call them the French, I suppose, in modern day French, took over England, and they ruled for a good old 300 years, I think, 300, 400 years in England. And what did they do? They brought French. French became the royal language of England. English was spoken by the peasants and the normal folk, I suppose, while the royals spoke French. So, you see all that influence. We've got the Celts, we've got the Romans, we've got the Anglo-Saxons, and then we've got the Normans, and a bit of influence as well from Scandinavia, all trying to invade the British Isles. It's worth noting that since the Normans in 1066, the British Isles have never been successfully conquered. Thankfully, I suppose. Last time was the Germans. So what's the point? My point is that English is an inclusive language. We'll see here in a moment that I suppose what happened was, when I say inclusive, what I mean is that it didn't reject other languages. It sort of incorporated other languages into English. It was malleable, it was flexible, so it allowed other languages into itself. And we'll see from this example here, we have fast, which is what would be modern day German, similar to modern day German. We have comfortable, which is very similar to French. In fact, anything with the able comes from French. Now we've got, confortable, or table, or table. So this able comes from French. Then we have shampoo. Shampoo, apparently it's Indian. Very interesting. And wigwam, or teepee, I suppose, is a Native American word. And they are all part of English now. So, here's a more graphic history of the English language. You could pause the video and read all about it, I suppose. But a lot of things happening and a lot of influences on English. So there you go, Beowulf in the 700s. And you had Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales in 1343, important, and then later on Shakespeare. Had the 100-Year War. There you go, the 100-Year War where French was devalued because the English won that war. Wasn't actually a 100-year war. It was a lot of little wars or little battles during a 100-year period. And later on, you've got these empire imports with Britain expanding globally. I suppose it exported but also imported language. So, like I just said, English has also been exported. If we look at a map here of the British Empire in the 1920s, it was the empire that never slept, as they said. It was literally covered a third of the world. And English was used to essentially unite India. India, I think, has a crazy amount of local languages. So English was a convenient way of bringing everything together. Of course, that's why then you also have this shampoo and other words that come from these faraway places back into the English language. But you can see how, well, English was used as an administrative language around the whole world. You also see examples of English in other languages. So in Austria, they say Big Macs. Well, big is big, isn't it, right? So Italy as well, Il Software. No, and in German they say das Cashflow. Excuse my German accent. So English has been exported as well as importing other languages into it. So English became the lingua franca, and what I mean by lingua franca is like the common language, the universal language, mainly with the rise of the USA, because before the rise of the USA, there were the French was the lingua franca. Everything was done in French. Everything politically, diplomatically, French was the recognized lingua franca of the world. Part of that, because of its history as being a kind of a royal language, French was designed to be difficult to learn. It was never designed to be a common tongue. It was for the elite. And that's why it's incredibly difficult to learn today. And that's why it makes English a little bit difficult, because it comes quite a lot from French. English is also today the trading language of the world. If you look at business, it's all done in English. English. Everything dominates in terms of trade. It's also obviously widely being, it goes hand in hand with technology. Obviously, the USA being a dominant economy and a dominant force in innovation and technology, it has pushed the importance of English even further. Look at social media. I think everyone in the world, almost everyone in this world these days, knows two words in English: face and book. So we can see how technology has, especially coming from these economies, the UK, USA, it has driven the importance of the English language. Even so that there was a French medical journal. I can't remember exactly its name, but it had to change its publications from French to English because not enough people were reading it. And the same goes for engineers and scientists. I mean, most of scientific publications are in English. And I read a statistic that 45% of websites are in English. So there's this relation to technology with the language that drives the importance of learning it as a skill. And of course, there's also the soft power of culture. If you look at the soft power of rock and roll and bands like Pink Floyd and the Sex Pistols and all sorts of music in Hollywood and movies, they're all in English. A lot of it's in English. These days, things like Bollywood are getting more and more are gaining importance as well, but you can't deny the effect that, or the soft power that culture has had on influencing the world. How people learn through music, through movies, and it kind of opens people up to learning the language. It makes them feel, well, I suppose it's, a lot of people like, I mean, if you, in South America, people love classic rock, for example. They just absolutely love it. And you can't help but think that that has an effect on people's image, of English. They see it as something that's awesome, that's cool, that makes them want to learn it. It's easily shared, and certainly has its influence. So it's worth noting that there are different dialects of English, and what I mean by dialects is that there are certain trends to different geographical places. So you've got American versus British English, and I probably should have written this correctly, but it's North American English versus British English. So North American English basically is Canada and the USA, whilst British English is, well, the UK, South Africa, Australia, India, Asia. I mean, I believe that most people in Europe are taught British English over American English. So there are these slight distinctions, but overall, I mean, I'll give you a few examples. For example, you've got in American English, you say, I have a car, whereas the British English say, I've got a car. So there's a small grammar difference in there, but that's about it. The other thing is vocabulary, trousers to pants, and rubbish to garbage or trash. So there are some slight differences. Also, British English is slightly more, it's more developed in terms of the pronunciation. There are 4 more sounds in British English over the American English. However, considering the differences, there are actually a lot of similarities. We really have no issues with understanding each other. There's a few slip-ups here and there, but it's really not a big difference. Perhaps it's moving apart slightly. There are some spelling differences, by the way. They kind of go away from the French and become more logical in their spelling, the Americans. Or they like to say that we invented it and they perfected it, but well, I'm not sure if I believe. Well, fine. I'm partial to being, I'm biased essentially. But yeah, not a big difference considering the time that they've been independent from each other. So that's convenient. However, you do have some parts of the world that have kind of moved away. Essentially, they haven't stuck to the standard. So a standard is incredibly important. We have standards in order for things to work the same way as we would expect them to. So you imagine that the British education system and the American educational system is, relatively better than in other places of the world. So they've been able to maintain those standards. For example, received pronunciation. So how English should sound, although very few people actually speak with RP. We've got examples around the world where English has kind of deviated into a kind of Creole mix. Simplified, perhaps. Some people might say Pidgin English, but I dare say that might not be politically correct. So in Sierra Leone, rather than saying how are you, they'll say how be the body. How be the body, which is kind of cool. I kind of like it, but simplified, right? They're not conjugating the verb to be. And if you go to Jamaica, you might hear wagwan, which means how are you. So there are these varieties of English that have just kind of resemble English. But if you've ever watched that movie, The Rockers, it's a Jamaican film, really cool film. You need subtitles. You just no idea what's really being said, even though it resembles English. So, English is rich in vocabulary. very, very rich in vocabulary. Why? Well, we looked at the examples before. It's an inclusive language. It brings other languages into it. It also is the technological and scientific language of the world. So the English dictionary has 600,000 registered entries in it, which is a lot of words, right? In fact, you could probably add another million more if you went into all the scientific terms too. So a huge amount of vocabulary. Whereas if you look at German, 184,000, French, 100,000, Spanish, only 80,000 words. This is why our learners get confused. They say, "Oh, what's fast? Oh, I thought it was rapid. It was just fast, rapid. What about quick?" It's like, no, they all mean the same. Yeah, they're just different ways of saying it. In fact, it's so rich in vocabulary, and it's unique in this aspect, that it is the only language in the world that has a thesaurus. Literally, the thesaurus, which if you're not familiar with, is basically a book of synonyms, does not exist in any other language. So that's the extent that I suppose you'll find when you're teaching English, that you might have some issues that the scale that is needed to learn English is just so many words, which I suppose makes it a little bit more difficult to learn. However, it also makes it quite rich and quite profound. You can really find so many words for the word, for example, beautiful, incredible, magnificent, splendid, lovely. There's so many options that makes it quite interesting, I suppose. So, rich language, very, 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 very rich language. And English also has flexibility, like these young lady dancers here. In German, ich sing. I don't know if my pronunciation is great. I don't speak German. French, I do speak French. So je chante, not bad, right? English, you can say I sing, I do sing, or I'm singing. So, well, in German and French, only one way of saying things. In English, you've got three ways of saying more or less the same thing. You also, in English, is much more common than other languages to have this kind of passive voice. I kicked the dog, or the dog was kicked by me. Active voice, passive voice. Don't often find that in other languages, but it's quite common in English. It's best to avoid the passive voice, though it does confuse your students. Not really, makes things a bit more complicated without really it being necessary. In French, for example, as well, they cannot distinguish between home and house. Maison, c'est mon maison. Mind and brain. Man and gentleman. And I wrote and I have written. So they're more limited. It's more limited in that sense. And in English, you can get maximum work from English words. So all of these examples are nouns and verbs. Drink, fight, fire, sleep, run, fun, look, act, view, silence, bend, cut, reach, like, dislike, and so on. So, I would like a drink. I drink every day. I had a fight. I fight every day. There was a fire. I'm going to fire you. And so on and so forth. A lot of flexibility there. However, English can be perplexing. Kind of confusing. Why? To be or be? Not to be. This is the full infinitive or the bare infinitive. You'll learn more about that later. But it's a bit weird, isn't it? Why this one? Why that one? Well, look at this one. I went swimming. That's the participle. Swimming is great. That's a gerund. Well, in both cases, it means the same thing. However, they have different grammatical functions. Or they've got different names. But essentially, they're acting in the same way. The word fly can mean a means of travel. It can also be an insect. It can also be a critical part of men's attire. Yes, flying low. Also, English has more sounds than most languages. In fact, any language, I think, that I'm aware of anyway. If you know any others that have more sounds in English, please let me know. There are, in fact, 44 sounds in English. If you're taking British English, if it's American English, then they count 40. What is different about English is there are less tonal differences. Like in Asian languages, I'm pretty sure their word for yes, if pronounced incorrectly, can also mean, it's about 190 different things. So it's all about in English we don't really change tone. It's not yes, 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 yes. It doesn't change, it's just yes. Because we've got all these sounds to articulate what our meaning. Whereas in Asian languages, they have less sounds, but those sounds can vary. English is also connected. It's stressed and it has a stressed and unstressed rhythm. So let's compare it with Spanish. Spanish is kind of punchy. It's like bam, 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 bam. Yo voy a comer hoy día. It's like, okay, bum, bum, bum. Every single syllable is given the same importance and the same kind of stress. Now, English is not like that. We've got stress on stress, stress on stress. We tend to stress what gives context, but again, we'll learn more about that later. But the point is, it's all kind of connected. And other languages are not like that. Also, in English, we have a lot of consonant clusters. Clusters. Whereas Asian languages, for example, they don't. They just avoid that like the plague. And of course, English pronunciation also consists of more just than sounds, like intonation. Oh, really? The tone. They say, well, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I love you. I love you. I love you. Oh, I love you. You get my point. And that rhythm as well. That rhythm is important. It makes understanding English so helpful to understand the rhythm of how it flows. It's not, hello, my name is Ben. No, it's hello, my name is Ben. Yeah, it's got a rhythm to it. There is, thankfully, some simplicity to English. English, you just say you. In German, you say du, dich, dir, sie, and I have no idea how to pronounce the last ones. I'm not going to try. But you get the point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ways to say you. In English, it's just you. Also, English is free of gender. Love it. Love it. I just say the. Spanish is it el dia or la dia? Isn't it la dia because it ends in an A? Oh no, that's an irregular. It's el dia. Oh, do you know what I mean? It's just a pain. And also English is concise. It's not like German. Can you pronounce that? Give it a shot. Try it at home. Wirtschaftsgesellschaft. Any Germans? Help me out, please. That means a business trust company. So, some simplicity. But it can also be confusing and illogical. And you'll probably find this all over your teaching experience. You'll be like, why is it like that? So, for example, why is it 4 but 40? Right? Why are we dropping the U? Why are we not being consistent? Why is it shelf and then shelves? It's just like, why is it child and then children? Child, children. Why does that have to change? So, it can be difficult for your students. Now, you want to learn more about the English language? Well, I would highly recommend reading Bill Brysons' A Mother Tongue. This is actually where I got quite a lot of my information from. He's a really good author. It was written in the 80s, I think. He's a brilliant author, and I highly recommend reading it. He goes into so much more depth than I have today. And it's worth knowing, it's worth knowing a bit more about what you're teaching, where it's come from. So I hope this has helped. I wanted to review English is an inclusive language. It's a mix of many languages. Mostly French, but you have the imports from the British Empire. You have German roots, and you have Celtic roots, and you have some Scandinavian roots, and basically it's all said, okay, everybody, come to the party, you're all welcome. English, therefore, has more words than most languages, very rich in vocabulary, partly because of the technology and scientific sides of things. It also has more sounds than most languages, so that's really interesting, and that will shock your students. Tell them, how many vowels are there in English? And they'll say, A-E-I-O. 5, teacher. And then you go, nope, that's written. I'm talking about sounds. How many vowel sounds are there? I don't know, teacher. 20. And they go, what? And they're blown away by it. It's just not even conceivable. And lastly, but not least, English is an incredibly useful language. Like I said, it's spoken by mostly people who are non-natives. It's a commercial language. It's used to communicate. It's a tool. It's a tool for getting you from A to B. I need to, how awesome is this that maybe not even 30, 40 years ago, now you go traveling and you can just meet to everyone from every part of the world. Doesn't that promote compassion and understanding? And isn't that a great thing for the world? Surely that's much better than, probably 100 years ago when the Germans and the British were at war and they were like, there's a little misunderstanding. They didn't understand each other. So that's probably why they were at war, because they were like, I don't know what he's saying. And that created distrust and whatnot. And that's just me speculating anyway. So you made it. You made it through just the introduction. Long way to go still. However, if you're enjoying it so far and you think someone else might enjoy this lecture, these parts are actually free for anyone to watch. So share it if you want. Share it to somebody who might actually benefit from learning a little bit more about English. And I'll see you in the next module, in the first module, and I can't wait to see you there. So, hasta la vista.